Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this afternoon's panel. I hope everyone can hear me. Am I audible enough? Okay, awesome. Thank you, everyone. Again, thank you for joining us. I am Olutobi Kingbade. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow with the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy, and I will be moderating the panel discussion and the conversation we'll be having this afternoon. Of course, it goes without saying that when we talk about higher education and social justice, the importance cannot be overemphasized. It cannot be overemphasized. And so we'll be looking at this critical and sensitive area this afternoon. And we're very happy and delighted to have a very mix of dynamic and dynamic and vast academics in the house to present and speak to these very important issues. We're yet to be joined by Dr. Desire Chiwandire. Tech, please help us to bring him onto the stage. We're still waiting for him to join us on the stage. Dr. Desire, we're waiting for you. And please, everyone, feel free to post your questions and your comments via the chat function and the Q&A function. Don't wait till the end of the presentations before you do that. Just please go ahead and drop the interesting comment and question for us once it comes to your mind. This afternoon we have three papers will be presented. The first one is going to be presented by Mtubu from the University of Cape Town. Thank you for joining us. And also the second paper will be presented by Professor Salo, Ricardo Nascimento, and Greg Ruiters. And the third paper will be presented by Dr. Desire Chiwandire. And we're still waiting for him to join us. And so we'll go ahead and start, and hopefully he will join us along the line. The first paper by Mtubu is titled "The State of South African State's Education System." Yes, Iviwe is passionate about leading system change to achieve quality education for all learners. He currently serves as Director for Academics and Curriculum at the Students' Health and Welfare Centers organization. Amongst other things, he is 2021 Mail and Guardian Top 200 Young South Africans winner under the education category. And also he's a fellow of Democracy Works Academy. If you will, thank you for joining us. Without much ado, if you can just take it up from there, please, and present your very interesting paper. And also, please, everyone, drop your questions, like I've said earlier, via the chat and Q&A function. Iviwe, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Iviwe, as mentioned. Wow, that's a lot of pressure. I'm with professors. I am a final year student at the University of Cape Town. I'm doing my undergrad. I am 20 years old. I submitted my paper in my capacity as a civil society activist. So today I'll be speaking more on education. Thank you. Next slide. Coolies, a little bit about myself. I am, of course, 20 years old. I do attend the University of Cape Town. I studied environmental and geographical science. I am a teaching intern at Westerford High School, teaching geography. I am an education enthusiast. My life's goal really is to shift and to lead system change in education. So hence my, although studying the sciences, but being very much involved in the education space. And I get to do a lot of that through Shoko Education.
Able to present, right?
Next slide. Okay, moving to what today's about. South Africa has a broken and unequal education system, perpetuating poverty and inequality. This paper was published on the 11th of February by Amnesty International. The South African education system is characterized by crumbling infrastructure, overcrowded classrooms, and relatively poor infrastructure. And it is perpetuating inequality, and as a result, failing too many of its children with the poor hardest hit, according to a new report by Amnesty International. Now, if we are to look at generally how our education looks, we are a country that is generally focused on educational outcomes. And, we look at matric results, and then we talk about that as if there's no context to that. Of course, a lot of people would know that more than 3/4 of children aged 9 cannot read for meaning in this country. We have poor mathematics results, and the government is all about that. Then we say we have ill-trained teachers, and then we blame the teachers again. But can I go to the next slide? There's something I want us to realize, or I want us to ask ourselves. Where are the poorest performing schools in our country? That's the biggest thing that the government fails to answer. If we look at Limpopo alone as one of our poorest provinces, in Limpopo as high as 91%, and in the Eastern Cape, 85% of learners are unable to read, aged 9. Now, and of 100 learners that start school, 50 to 60% will make it to matric. 40 to 50% will pass matric, and only 14 of those will go to university. And we need to ask ourselves, where do those 14 come from? Now, I highlight this because context is important, space is important. And my presentation today is centered around the influence of space in education, how space influences our educational outcomes. Can we go to the next slide? Again, now architecture, I'm not an architect, but I would assume that architecture is intentional. Architecture, a building is built for a reason at a specific time. It is built for a type of people. It is meant to make certain statements. Now attached is a picture of a school in the Eastern Cape. As a government, what message are we sending to our beneficiaries? If a school looks like that, what are we saying about the kids? What does this school, what message is this sending? This, in my abstract, I say that it reflects the deplorable poverty of the majority of our country. Next slide. Now, if again we are to look at the impact of architecture, what architecture does in a certain space. Now, majority of these schools are generally in township and rural areas, and we know that poverty is a major stumbling block for no-fee paying schools. But I want to now look at schools that actually look like schools that were built for a purpose in these contexts, in a township, and what that does, in a rural area, and what that does. Now, here we have COSAT, Center of Science and Technology in Khayelitsha, South Africa. I couldn't get a better picture, but this school looks very beautiful. This school has labs. This school has, science labs, computer labs. And this school is one, as a science school, is one of the high performing schools in Khayelitsha. Next slide, please. Then here we have another school, Nyanga High School in Engcobo, Eastern Cape. This is a rural school in a rural area. And the government normally use the school as a banner carrier for rural success. Now, the two schools are presented here are schools, again, that are high achieving. Nyanga High in 2019 got 95.4% pass rate, which beats a lot of other quintile 4 schools. But these schools are what schools should look like in those settings. They're, of course, not a proper representation of how schools in townships look and how schools in rural areas look, obviously. And the government uses these schools as some model schools, as if all schools in these areas are supposed to perform in the same levels as these schools. Now, again, I'm not saying that these schools achieve highly only because of the type of buildings they have, but resources are highly tied to the outcomes of these schools. These schools are funded, there are corporations that fund these schools. These schools have all the resources necessary for academic success. In the Eastern Cape alone, there are about 582 mud schools. And this number is estimated to have increased between 2018 and 2021. And generally, our government always blames apartheid and that these schools were built in the apartheid era. But many studies are starting to highlight that much of these schools are actually increasing. And then again, we ask ourselves, why? Why are we achieving poor results? Besides teacher education, the context one learns in has a lot to do, has a huge influence in what comes out of that area. We know a lot of purpose-built areas that were not built for the success of its inhabitants, areas that were built to stack people on top of each other, like the Cape Flats. What comes out of there? Most of the time, gangsterism. Now, if I'm learning or I'm studying in an area that, or in a school that does not look like a school, in a school that is not well equipped, and I'm expected to perform in the same levels, as a child that went to a school in an urban area, I'm expected to have the same admission point scores as a child that went to to another area. So again, I am proposing a shift in the way we do things, that there is a need for redress in a lot of our rural and township schools, that our focus should not really be on the outcomes, but on the context of the school, on the physical school itself. Our country lacks, or our schools lack, concrete infrastructure. And that, I propose, is one of the major reasons why we have a huge lack in educational outcomes in South Africa. If we are to look in an urban setting, in the top schools of this country, the wealthiest schools of this country, children in the top 200 schools achieve more distinctions in mathematics than children in the next 6,600 schools in our country combined. Now we need to ask ourselves again, apart from the type of teacher that teaches these pupils, but where are these other pupils learning? And what are we doing about it? Are we, after one mud classroom collapses, we go on and put a temporary classroom that is going to stay there for the next 20 years? Temporary, it's a permanent temporary. So again, this is a mere conversation starter. Something to highlight to the government. I'm not an academic, but it's something to highlight to the government that much needs to be done in rural areas, much needs to be done in in townships, because a lot of these schools were built in a particular context. A lot of these schools were built for Bantu education, a system that was not designed for the success of a Black and a colored learner, a system that was designed to oppress a colored and black learner. And post-1994, there was no redefinition of these schools. There was no redesign of these schools. So again, I said architecture is intentional. The architecture of these schools still perpetuate the initial or the intended message of the apartheid government, even post-1994. Next slide. Thank you. So what now? Is a mere rebuilding of schools going to improve our curriculum? Well, it has a high probability of, improving our outputs, because many studies show that resources and physical architecture have a lot to do with what actually happens at schools, what takes place in the physical building. Thank you so much. That's the end of my presentation.
So much. Thanks so much for that very thought-provoking presentation. That was indeed very rich. Thanks so much. And please, let's post our questions in the chat and Q&A function. Thank you very much once again for that question, for that presentation. Without much ado, we'll move on to the next presentation that will be handled. The paper will be handled by Professor Salo, like I said earlier, Ricardo Nascimento, and Greg Ruiters. The paper, very interesting, titled Teaching Transnational Literacies for Anti-Racist Solidarities via Virtual Exchanges between learners in Cape Town, Fortaleza, and Champaign in Chicago. Okay, just to briefly highlight our professor's area of study and focus. Professor Salo is a clinical professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Illinois in the United States of America. His teaching and research focus on comparative international human rights law, social and environmental justice in South Africa, Brazil, and in the United States. Professor Greg Ruiters is a professor of governance and public policy at University of Western Cape in South Africa. His teaching and research focus on the history of geography of social inequalities in South Africa and public policy responses. And also joining us all the way from Brazil, we have Professor Ricardo Nascimento. Is a professor at Unilab in Brazil. His teaching and research focus on cultural practices of resistance worldwide within context-specific areas and cases. Over to you, Professor Salo. You have 15 minutes, so I guess that is 5 minutes per person. Yes, please, we trust you to help us manage our time. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Oladubi. Greetings. Bom dia, Morse, Molweni, or as they say here in the streets of Chicago, what's up, brothers and sisters, or in the Cape Flats, who's it? Of course, Olatobo, thanks for trusting us. I don't know, we act in 3 parts. We're going to try and be disciplined. I wanted to also just give a quick shout out to the previous presenter, Iviwe, as the intergenerational scholar, very encouraging. Let me start, and I think I get a sense that, you know, from this panel, geography and space matters. I think that's one of the key things. And let me just make 2 opening remarks. One is in terms of this, well, Iviwe's motivated me to share the Fanonius quote that, of course, every generation out of relative obscurity is going to have to discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. So that is the task that this generation has. Those of you who were inspired, were able to attend the wonderful presentation by Pedro Mzeleni earlier, got the sense of this political geography of higher education. So on the theme of the political geography of social justice, let me again refer to the Fanonius quote that, as he says in his first chapter on violence, is that the colonial world, of course, is a compartmentalized world. The colonized world is a world divided in two. And here he goes on to argue very insightfully that the role of education, it seems, in a capitalist society is to be the handmaiden of law and order. So the people on this panel are inspired to speak back against this. And so in some sense, we differently represent, you know, a generation that I think Mahmoud Maudani referred to in the 76, the anti-racist, or what we might, some people call the Steve Biko generation. Part of what we are trying to uncover, recover, is that political activist tradition. And it's very encouraging that it's still very much alive and kicking. So we all come from different political backgrounds. Greg, Ruiters, and myself grew up in, for our sins, in Cape Town, part of a different tradition. I particularly from the non-European unity movements, and a sort of more internationalist than nationalist tradition. Ricardo is from a different generation. So given the conditions we're working under right now, we were inspired to think through this virtual connections, and we were all differently circulating before that in what is called study abroad. But one of the things that we realized is that, of course, the problem of racism is a global problem, and that each one of us is dealing with local expressions of a global problem. And I think that is part of the insight of reconstructing this political community. So that's the project. The idea is to see if we can recover higher education as a site of social justice. And of course, this has a very checkered, you know, history. So if you can move on to the next slide, we'll walk you through the details of each. So I'm trying here just to give you some notion of framing. We use the term transnational literacies differently. I mentioned earlier the Fanonist tradition, of course, the Freirean aspect of the pedagogy and practice of praxis, starting with the lived experiences, the Brazilian philosopher Abdi Nascimento, in the US, Bell Hooks. I don't need to remind you of Steve Biko's legacy. Of course, famously, Gayatri Spivak basically argued for transnational literacies to be conceived of as the dominant ideas that we and our students need to unlearn. In other words, we're all infected by these ideas growing up in racialized and compartmentalized worlds. So how do we unlearn? We're arguing that racism needs to be unlearned. Specifically, we are interested as geographers or cultural theorists, cultural geographers, legal, political geographers, the idea of what might be called cognitive mapping. So when and how do students recognize racial practices? When and how do they resist particularly invisibilized or normalized forms of systemic racism? And we argue that the urban landscape is one of those forms of normalized systemic racism. And this, we argue, almost in the metaphor of an iceberg, is what's largely invisible. Our pedagogy is through cross-cultural, of course, transnational dialogues. If you move to the next frame. So we each teach courses both in Midwest University, Cape Town, and Unilabe. My course here particularly focuses on so-called race, or those of old G's like us, we talk about the race in inverted commas, social justice in cities, and we want to explore the repressions of urban rebellion. So I take here as my point of departure this idea that protests or rebellions and uprising, famously the George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter, which now of course go global, resulting in the removal of these statues from urban landscapes. Just yesterday, the Robert E. Lee statue came down in Virginia, North Carolina. So how do we, that is the entry point, and we're looking at ways in which these rebellions are repressed through something that you might call certain socialism called the white racial frame. So it's an ideological point, and seeing the dialectics and dynamics of racialization, rebellion and repression. Next slide, please. All right, what do we hope is that students will be able to recognize, that's easier said than done. They'll be able to map, in other words, spatially represent, based on their lived experiences of navigating the compartmentalized geography and compromised mobilities, and more importantly, that they share these experiences and strategies to resist these everyday systemic racisms and urban places. We argue that protests are ways in which we cross these geographical boundaries and borders. And then we want to create a dialogue, a transnational dialogue of anti-racist solidarities that's grounded in what we call communities in resistance. Next slide, thank you. All right, so specifically in each course, what do we hope to do? They will, of course, tell stories, and those stories that will share on how they differently recognize and respond to these racialized socio-spatial geographies. So everybody in each geographical context is dealing with their cultural stereotypes. They will map these. They will also make a timeline, and this is, of course, the point that there's a dive into the historical past, and this is what we're trying to foster is a historical understanding, and then also historical understanding of resistance practices. All right. Then moving towards the future, how do they propose pathways? And then we're going to publish these digital maps as to share online. Next slide, thank you. All right, so we're going to take questions at the end of the presentation, and the next slide will be the kickoff slide from my collaborator, compañero, Professor Ricardo Nascimento. Please, it's all yours.
So, good afternoon, everyone. Can you pass? Thanks, Ken. Racial questions are serious and historical questions in Brazilian society. I want to present to you a little bit of how we deal with that. And at the university, I work as a teacher of sociology. This university was created 10 years ago on a democratic government of Lula and Dilma to promote the dialogue south to south with Lusophone African countries. Can you pass, please, Ken? So I want to present you 3 actions that the university did on those last years. The first one is about inclusion of knowledge, pluri-epistemic inclusion of knowledge that involves local communities, indigenous communities, Black communities, and it's not only about including people, but especially because those people and at the cultural practice level, they produce knowledge that has been excluded from university all those years. And this idea is to recognize this knowledge and include those masters, those promoters of this culture inside of university. Can you please pass the next one? So once we recognize and certificate this knowledge, the idea is that we create courses as this one that you were looking at. It's called Philosophy and Practice of Capoeira and Samba. Capoeira is an Afro-Brazilian practice, and Samba is a national kind of Afro-Brazilian national rhythm. And we do believe that this cultural practice, they also embody knowledge that can be useful at the school for our teachers as a method, as a knowledge that can talk about and discuss anti-racism questions. Please, can you pass the last one? And at the end, we do believe that affirmative action program is necessary. We include knowledge, we include this knowledge and these people inside of the university. We are talking about more than half of population of Brazil, this Afro-Brazilian population, included indigenous population, and it's a necessary and historical matter to our university to promote this inclusion. Thank you. If you have any questions, we will answer at the end.
Next slide.
Come on.
Can you do the next slide, please? Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Greg, and I teach at the University of the Western Cape. We are very excited about the project. The students are also excited. They're going to understand not only their own situation, but they're going to talk about that situation in a comparative context. And so I think the idea of transnational literacies, as my colleagues have explained, it's a very exciting new kind of pedagogy just a new way of thinking about your own realities and situating yourself in a much bigger context, historically and geographically. And I'm very pleased that the very first speaker also spoke about architecture. I think that's an incredibly important concept. And the messages that get sent out through the built environment. And Cape Town, as we all know, UWC is in Bellville. Sometimes we wonder where exactly Bellville fits into Cape Town. But the kind of geography of the city deeply affects the kind of spatial experience that our students have when they arrive from different parts of South Africa. Historically, as you all know, UWC was a so-called colored university. Today, it's a kind of 50-50 split. But we also know that racism in the past and racism as it functions today, there's an overlap. There was a very unfortunate phrase that the DA former premier of the province used, and it created a huge, obviously, stir, when people from the Eastern Cape were called refugees. That just stirred up this whole problem that we have in the country of provinces and of Bantustans. So there's a particular kind of space. If I'm from the Eastern Cape and I come to Cape Town, I carry a certain kind of burden, if you like, a spatial burden, and a certain kind of spatial history. And that immediately feeds into my experience at UWC. And there are also efforts at the university to transform the place architecturally, so that the students feel that, UWC is not for people from historically colored communities. But the kind of geography, demonic, you can even call it, of South Africa and of Cape Town in particular, is a constant message to our students at UWC that they are still living in a very racialized society and that there are new forms of exclusion and racism. And so I've developed a set of readings. If you go to the next slide. This is another image that's also characterizes, the problem, the sort of demonic geographies of racism, the grotesqueness of racism as it exists right now, where refugee camps, these townships that we have in Cape Town are essentially refugee camps. Constant fires. Cape Town has more shacks than any other city, and there's a sort of narrative saying, no, don't worry, we're trying to sort it out. The problem is people come from other provinces and they kind of create the problem themselves. It's not, it's partly because we're so successful in Cape Town. People want to come here. So there's a narrative, a kind of convoluted narrative of that implicates Cape Town in the entire country as well, in terms of the way people are moving, and also the sort of white spaces. If you can move to the next slide. How whiteness gets recreated in South Africa. So when there's a fire, a shack, out by the famous Imizamuyethu, virtually every year there's hundreds of shacks are destroyed. Then you have a mobilization of white people around charity, and these same white people, live just a few hundred meters away. And so the way people deal with it is through, let's organize blankets, and the state itself has a particular way of dealing with it. But some of our students live in these conditions. And so what kind of architecture are we recreating? Very little's been done in South Africa as a whole, and in Cape Town in particular, to change the spatial geography and the legacy of apartheid. In fact, everything we do reinforces that legacy. The RDP houses that are built in exactly the same places. You can move to the next slide. So the thesis that we're trying to explore for the students through their own experiences is for them to map, if you travel through Cape Town, you move through different kind of geographies. You move from UWC through to the neighboring shack settlements and into a highway, and then you see Langa, Guguletu. You then get to Camps Bay, and then you just start to realize, goodness gracious, what's happened, you know? I've just reversed all these different kind of these different societies, more or less. And what are the interactions between these different spaces? The people who live in Khayelitsha have to travel to go and work in camp space. So there's a particular kind of labor relationship going on, a relationship of active underdevelopment. And so we want to introduce students to those sorts of things and think about the thesis of thesis 1. If you go to the next slide, you'll see we have a few ideas that we want to play with. Those are the readings that we're going to ask students in all the 3 places to read, from Brazil, Chicago. We're going to take them through some of these ideas about the national question in South Africa. You know, are we anywhere close to solving our problem? What are the new forms of racialization? What's the intersection of neoliberalism and race and class and those sorts of things? And there are a number of ways of thinking about it. We can move to the next
Thank
slide.
you, Prof. Seems our time is up now.
Okay,
you can
no
just
problem.
wrap up in 1 minute, please.
Yeah, just go to the next slide. Thank you. I'm going to wrap up. Okay, so this is an example of a sort of thesis that we would ask the students to explore, and for them to raise new questions. You can go to the next slide. And then there's a list of questions, and the questions really are an invitation for more questions. So the whole point of the exercise is for people to ask questions and then to compare their spatial experiences of navigating these, as Ken has explained, you know, these kind of containerized spaces. What are their experiences and how do we overcome them? I mean, do we become, you know, we break the law? Are we transgressive? How do we organize to overcome and transcend the spatial sort of messages, the architecture, and the humiliation and the suffering and the damage that all of this causes in terms of building a truly non-racial society? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that insightful presentation. That seems to me like a well thought out project, and it will be interesting to see it to see it fleshed out and developed further, and because of the social justice angle to it. Very interesting. Thank you so very much, professors. Without much ado, we go to Dr. Desire Chiwandire. Dr. Desire, if you can just come up. Dr. Desire is a postdoctoral fellow in the Chair for Critical Studies in Higher Education Transformation here at Nelson Mandela University. He also PhD in Political Studies from Rhodes University, and his thesis focused on disability inclusion in higher education. Dr. Desire will be speaking on a paper titled Campus Disability Activism and Advocacy for Students with Disabilities at South African Universities. Dr. Desire, thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Toby, for that kind introduction. Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon, everyone. My presentation actually focuses on issues of disability inclusion, and it's within the field of critical disability studies. So my focus on disability activism, this is one of the areas that, you know, dominant debates on disability inclusion, you know, because most of the debates tend to focus on how universities can best support students with disabilities to succeed, and then neglecting the issue of disability activism. So I think I'll also build on what most of my colleagues have been talking about, especially the issue of the architecture. Can you move to the next slide, please? Yes, so I'll just begin by defining the disability, you know. So I'll provide a detailed definition which covers both visible and invisible disabilities. So this definition has been provided by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which defines people with disabilities as those who have long-term physical and mental, intellectual, sensory impairments, which in interaction with the various barriers may hinder the full participation in the mainstream society. So one of the barriers in terms of equal participation is what my colleagues have spoken about, the architecture. You know, if the built environment is not inclusive, that can result in the exclusion with disabilities. Move to the next slide, please. Yes. So I was just going to talk about the two dominant models of disability in higher education, or particularly in the field of critical disability studies. So the first model talks about the medical model of disability. So under this medical model, this is when most countries did not have enabling legislation aimed at supporting the inclusion of persons with disabilities. Therefore, the disability was blamed on the individual rather than the society. Then secondly, we see a radical shift to the social model of disability, which places attention on how enabling the social environment is in terms of supporting persons with disabilities. So this is when we see the passage of disability legislation, you know, which is aimed at supporting students with disabilities. Next slide, please. And then the next one, just gonna summarize most of them. Yes. So I just want to talk about the shift from the non-binding legislation to binding legislation. So in South Africa, you find out that historically there were legislation which was like discriminatory. Let's say, for instance, the 1948 Special Schools Act, which provided for segregated education for learners with disabilities on the grounds of disability. Then we see a shift in post-19, where the ANC government implemented a number of enabling disability policies to ensure the mainstreaming of persons with disabilities. Then we start to see passage of disability inclusion legislation, including the regulations, which was aimed at ensuring that buildings could be made accessible for persons with disabilities. Next slide. Yes. So I think it's important to talk about the concept of inclusive education. You know, we can't talk about the inclusion of persons of learners with disabilities in universities without discussing the concept of inclusive education. So this concept basically involves the educating of learners with disabilities with their non-disabled peers in the regular classroom settings. So in South Africa, there is a number of legislation which are there to facilitate this, which includes the White Paper 6 and the National Disability Strategies. So despite having these policies in place, we find out that most students with disabilities in South Africa, they still face a number of challenges, you know, in terms of accessing and participation with success in higher education. Next slide. And then the next one. Next one. Yes. So my presentation focuses mainly on the concept of disability activism. What is disability activism or self-advocacy? So this is the ability to communicate one's needs and to make decisions about the supports necessary to achieve them. So disability activism is very important, especially for persons with disabilities, because when we look at the field of critical disability studies, it actually emerged as a result of persons with disabilities who were involved in disability activism and who were academics as well, because they started to question the way how they were constructed, you know, in the literature and in policies as people who were just consumers of state resources rather than contributors to the economy, right? Next slide. Yes, so the methodology that I conducted for this study, it's basically a document analysis, you know, where I reviewed secondary and primary literature on issues of disability inclusion in South Africa from 1994 to date. And I was mainly interested in exploring the students with disabilities in South Africa in South African universities were involved in disability activism and advocacy, and the potential impact that this has on their inclusion. So I analyzed the data through using qualitative content analysis, and then I used critical race theory to analyze as theoretical lens, because critical race, especially in understanding, in analyzing issues of intersectionality of disability and race in South Africa, including South Africa, where it is prevalent. Next slide. So when it comes to the findings of the study, I found out that, in many cases, you find out that most students don't have what you call self-advocacy skills. They transition to universities without what one would consider as good self-advocacy skills to challenge the oppressive higher education institution. And in many cases, this results from a lot of institutional barriers and bureaucratic structures that universities have if students are trying to get involved in disability activism. However, there are a few students, but these are mainly students who are involved in the SRC or in societies for students with disabilities. There's one at Rhodes called Inepu Society. There's one in Stellenbosch University called Dismatis, and there's also one at University of Pretoria called Tax Enabling Society. So one's involvement in these societies actually enables them to participate in disability activism initiatives. Next slide. So the other thing that the other dominant finding is that most students with disabilities often rely on disability unit staff members or support staff to advocate on their behalf, right? So for many students, some of them, it's perhaps the issue of, not knowing or maybe lack of confidence to speak to people in the management or people who have the power to make change in these institutions. So they always rely on disability unit staff members to advocate on their behalf. Next slide. So when it comes to the recommendations, is that, even though in South Africa, there's enabling disability policies which are aimed at facilitating the inclusion of persons with disabilities in higher education, we find out that most students still don't have self-advocacy skills, and some of them, they are not even familiar with their national or institutional disability policies, that issues like inclusive education is a right? So universities have not done much to ensure that they mainstream issues of disability inclusion when students transition to these universities. So therefore, there is a need to ensure that students with disabilities are given a voice, if these institutions are to respect the disability rights mantra of nothing about us without us. So there's also a need, to consult with students with disabilities on issues of disability inclusion. Because if we look at, current debates on decolonization of the built environment, the removal of statutes in universities and fees must fall, you find out that, people say, let's change the name of the building, but there are very few people who talk about how accessible is that building to persons with disabilities in the first place. So I think there is an important need to ensure that issues of disability activism are equally prioritized in higher education institutions, because without prioritizing these issues, it actually reinforces the exclusion of persons with disabilities who will continue to suffer in silence, because most of the research shows that students with disabilities have to work extra hard in order to succeed in higher education institutions, and sometimes they tend to take longer to finish their degrees. So I think these are some of the issues that students with disabilities need to stand up, and speak up for themselves if they are to the higher education institutions which are enabling and supportive of their rights. Last slide. I think that should be the last slide. Okay, it's about opportunities. So when you I've actually spoken about this to say in other institutions, disability activism tends to be thriving. Why? Because of students who are involved in SRC. SRC is also an important organization where students with disabilities who are involved in SRC actually push for their rights. And also sometimes some institutions, some SRC members, even though they don't have disabilities, they also tend to advocate for the rights of students with disabilities. In other institutions, it's also staff members, even lecturers. There are lecturers who are always, supportive of the rights of students with disabilities, but this is more on an individual basis. It's case by case. It's not all lecturers, but I think it's important also not for them to also get involved. And there's also a need to have a sensitized non-disabled university community, if institutions are to create an enabling environment for disability activism to thrive, because disability inclusion issues in universities tends to be relegated to disability unit staff members. So it has not been fully mainstreamed. So it is my hope that if disability inclusion issues are mainstreamed, that will make everyone to feel involved and take part in disability activism and even support initiatives which are aimed at advancing the rights of students with disabilities through disability activism. So yeah, I think that's all for my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Desire, for that presentation. That's actually thought-provoking. You've given us very important things to actually think about, And of course, we've always known that it's not just about policy making, but how does those policies translate vertically into ways that those policies become beneficial, to all and sundry, especially to the persons that will strive to make those policies for. Thank you so very much, Dr. Desire. Thank you, professors, and thank you, Iviwe, for those those thoughtful presentations. And now we go to the Q&A and to the comments we've received. If all our speakers can just come up, turn on their mic and cameras. If you will, I will want to start from you. Thank you very much for your presentation once again. And then we've seen comments here that says, what a great presentation. I think that's to view the spaces that have been created for learning truly have a huge impact on how children will perform indeed. The significance of place and context is indeed important. With political will, sustainable spaces that facilitate teaching and learning and create an environment for learners to flourish could be a reality. Indeed, could be a reality. If you want to speak to that, especially with regards to political will, you've been involved with, from your bio here, you've been involved with quite a number of platforms that I believe you must be able to talk about political will a little bit. Are we really going to see things change in the nearer future, or are we just going to sit here and talk and theorize about it? What do you say about that, specifically with regards to political will? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Olutobi. I think on a national capacity, much of these places that I had spoken about are relatively inaccessible. And accessibility is a big thing when you look at political will. It's odd that now we're nearing to elections, everyone is able to take a bus, go to the most remote areas, but on a day-to-day basis, these rural areas are seldom visited. So I do think that we need a bit more from politicians. And honestly, they're the ones that are able to really drive this type of change. So I think that in townships, we might have a different dynamic compared to rural areas. I think in rural areas, it might take a bit longer relative to townships. Townships do have some access to urban settings, and that's where most politicians will be located. So that's what I think, that rural areas might suffer a bit more compared to townships.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ibiwe. Thank you. If I can just go to our professors. There's a question here from our director at CANRAD. He says, "Thanks so much, Ken, Ricardo, and Greg. Really great project." Yes. He says, in his experience, South African students are quite parochial. How has your project enabled or not a deeper internationalist outlook into struggle? I think that's a very important point.
Great.
So if you can just take it from there, professors. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll kick off. Thanks so much, Alan. It's a great question. And let me, if I can, just remark on the earlier question of political will.
Yes,
and
please.
I think on the panel here with regard to education, I think also perhaps hasn't gotten, a better exposure is the role of educators, right? Particularly teachers. In the Western Cape, groups like the Teachers League of South Africa, right? So we all have high school teachers who are able to conscientize us. And I think if I were to place my money, I would rather bet on the teachers than on the politicians for us to bring about fundamental change. So, of course, I think a panel like this is the onslaught against education, as if you wanted, one of the most important fronts. So, moving into what Alan was asking, I think is correct. Of course, the idea is where and how to generate this internationalist perspective. I'll make just one or two remarks. Right now in the US, this moment of the sort of Black Lives Matter movement is in tension with the movement for Black Lives, when we've seen these protests of police repression going global, right? And trying to see, and those sorts of conversations. So I think our project has so far, in the brief conversations we've had, first asked students to engage with their stereotypes, right? So South African students, whether in the townships or in the urban areas, have stereotypes of Brazilian, students, educators, women. They grow up with these toxic, ideologies of the US. And so through this peer-to-peer dialogue, they begin to break down the popular culture, the corporate culture, and begin to recover subaltern cultures, working class cultures, of struggle. So, as I mentioned, in Chicago, the Chicago Teachers Union, and then lastly, I think an area that's very dear to Alan is the role of sports, right, and the role of racism in sports. So, of course, which students person doesn't love talking about sport? And I think beginning to share their struggles, about the racialized geography and politics of sport and creating those archives. Basically, it's uncovering those unspoken, those hidden struggles that so far has been left out, and amplifying those voices. There are a multitude of terrains. Ricardo, I think, is getting ready to share popular culture and what more, I guess, than music. So I'll hand it over to him to tell us about how music is the negotiator between the personal and the political. And then to Greg, go ahead.
Well, actually, I have to say that what I show here in this paper, basically, it seems beautiful and nice, but it's not that easy to promote such situations that we have over here, to promote, to discuss, and to act against racism at university, as we are passing a very hard time here, political times here in Brazil. Democracy so far has passed away here. But I believe small actions are very important as we are taking over here. It's a kind of a resistance, When we talk about capoeira or samba, which has this involves cultural practice, performance, local performance, traditional performance. We are talking about knowledge that has been produced as a resistance from those social groups. We're talking about the Black community, we're talking about the indigenous community, and they, for a very long time, they hide the way they resist those kind of performatic practice. But as I said, it's not easy to maintain this policies inside of the university, as we have, I have to say clear that the fascist government, just running after us all the time and looking of what we are doing at university, looking what we are saying, looking at what we are posting at social media. It's quite hard, but still we are resisting and acting. As I said about this idea of pluri-epistemic action, it's quite interesting because it's not only including people, the communities, as I said, the Black community and as well indigenous community. It's also including knowledge that has been excluded all this time. We're talking about at this right moment, we are working on certificating a local indigenous shaman who works with healing, with cure, and he has no academic diplomas or certificates at all. But we cannot deny or simply forget that the knowledge that he produces, it is a knowledge as well. So it is important that the university, that this knowledge take place inside of the university. It's very subversive in certain way, but it's necessary. For a very long time, we haven't seen this knowledge from this excluded, subalternized population. So I guess it is an important contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Greg, do you want to maybe add a line or two? Thank you.
Yeah, no, just to say there is political will, but it's going in the wrong direction. If you look at the will of the ruling class in South Africa, it's actually to sustain a neoliberal racial project where a small number of Black elites escape, if you like, or leave the township, and in its place they leave behind a very homogeneous, a very concentrated form of poverty in the townships, which we see today. The townships in most parts of South Africa are actually collapsing. Now the World Bank comes along and says, we need township economies, which is just another form of the old sort of theory of dual economies. So now suddenly we have a township economy. So I think what's going to come out of this course is that the students need to traverse these various places and travel, as it were, from UWC out to Camps Bay and then try and make sense of the unevenness and the neoliberalization of space. And the same thing is happening all over the world, I think. And that links up to the point about internationalization, to understand that, Brazil is Brazil because of sugar, because of slaves that were taken from West Africa. And so I think those connections are incredibly important to understand the history of how human beings were moved across space and the labor kind of connections, that people will move there for their labor, and that racism and class and the labor question are intimately tied up. So I think without understanding the neoliberalization of capitalism as it's unfolding globally and continuing to unfold, it's going to be very hard to make those international connections. Cape Town is a particularly authoritarian place. My colleague from Brazil talks about the kind of fascist, emerging kind of fascism there. And if you look at Cape Town, you'll be shocked to find out that there's more. They're spending so much money on land invasions. The biggest issue in Cape Town is land invasions. They have a special unit. The minute anybody transgresses space or claims another space that's supposedly part of private property or even public space, the state, the strong arm of the state is visible. Even homeless people, they have draconian laws for fining people who are supposedly homeless, to quote unquote reunite them with their families. Does that not sound familiar, the old forced removals? So I think Cape Town's an interesting place because they are at the forefront of a neoliberal agenda to defend mainly white bourgeois space against people that want to move in here. You know, you have informal settlements all the time, but people want to be close to work opportunities. And so people are going to continue to challenge this particular kind of spatial arrangement that we have in Cape Town. And I think it's interesting to link it up with places like Chicago and Brazil, and then see what the students make of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that contribution. Very, very interesting insight and perspective. There's another question here for Dr. Desire. Mark says, how do we ensure that universities are sensitive to issues around disabilities without pigeonholing students' identities to exclusively disabled? If you can maybe react to that, thank you.
Dr. Toby, sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Okay, I can do that. Mark says, how do we ensure that universities are sensitive to issues around disabilities? He's just trying to reflect on your presentation, and how do we make sure that universities are more sensitive to these issues, you know, at the same time without now pigeonholing students that have identities around this.
Okay, yes. I think the best way that universities can do this is to ensure that disability activism is an ongoing thing, you know, because very often disability activism, awareness raising initiatives at most universities only happens once in many cases, whether it's Disability Week or Disability Month. So I think what is needed is to ensure that, you know, we have conversations on disability inclusion issues or awareness raising on a monthly basis. And this should not only be the responsibility of the disability unit. It must be mainstreamed in a way. So each and every department should take the initiative, and these initiatives should not be like disability awareness, should be issues around diversity or diversity awareness, where persons with disabilities are included and other minority groups. You know, thank you. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, that answers. Thanks so much, Doc. I'm just thinking now, I will want professors in the house to please help us think along those lines. What are the place of civil societies in this project, in these issues, if you can reflect on it, and some sort of appraisal, how effective are civil societies been in raising these issues and in doing justice to these research areas that we are so keen about, very important areas, you know. And more specifically, if we can look at journalism, for instance, how can we say our journalists has fared in raising awareness, in raising maybe solution-based journalism to this issue? So if our professors can help us think along those lines first, then we'll go back to Dr. Desire. Then if we also look at that question in relation to his own specific presentation, you know, the place of civil societies and more specifically journalism, if that makes sense.
Olutobi, if I can, thanks for the question. I also have to jump off a little bit earlier. I have to keep the lights on here and go to work. But a key question you raise is the role of the press. And I want to contrast the corporate press versus, if you want to, the community press, right? And more particularly, well, maybe to slightly, you know, put a wrinkle in your concept of the civil society, I think more sort of uncivil society, right? Meaning the society that's in rebellion. So there's a rich tradition of, you know, grassroots or popular press who was putting a huge spotlight on these underreported stories. You know, there's groups like Roundup in Cape Town, and I think in the US now, this is a revival in this type of journalism. Part of the debate with the critical race theory is the project of the New York Times, actually the Pulitzer Center. Some of you have been following the journalist, Nicole Hannah-Jones, where she put together the 1619 project in opposition to the 1776 project. All by way of saying is there's an onslaught for a neglect of historical understanding. It's happening, as a key precursor for this type of fascism that Ricardo is mentioning. And in the US, they've just, emerged by the skin of their teeth, a year ago under another type of white supremacist fascism. So the situation is very dangerous, it's very uncertain. And I think this conscious understanding and the role of journalism and in reporting in war, what's happening in Afghanistan, in Iraq, the late, there's John Pilger's work. So all by way of saying that's a very, very important question. Schools of journalism are going to be in the forefront of this, but also street reporters. Our project is hoping to, if you want to create what we think of as citizen journalists, right? Street journalists. In other words, for them now with the technology, they all have smartphones. They're going to upload their own stories and publish that online in accessible. So our project is to create these kind of street journalists to tell the stories that are largely neglected and to amplify the voices and therefore the agency, not only of the students, but also, as we know from 76, the collaboration of students and workers. Thank you so much.
So much. Thanks for your contribution. Professor Ricardo, if you will.
Actually, let me say before I answer how great for us is to have this talk, especially because I believe that at this colonial level, the Anglophone world usually never discuss or dialogue with the Latin American countries and cultures. So it's quite interesting. Here in Brazil, we are living a very specific situation. As I mentioned, we have Jair Bolsonaro's government, which is, a fascist government, as I described. And right now, fake news is the biggest talk at the news and journalism here. Right now, we have the biggest strike and social movements of indigenous people in Brasilia, the capital of Brazil. But if you, once I'm telling you this does not appear at the TV news, not at all. Millions of indigenous peoples are right now, men and women in Brasilia, struggling for land and democracy, but that won't appear at the TV. The journalists keep no attention to that, And as they are millions, they say they are just a couple of people over there. It's quite strange, to live in this situation. I don't know how it is in South Africa and other parts, but that's how we are living. I think civil society has a very important role in change, especially at university. As I described in the place I work, those changes that I present over here, they were not able without the pressure of those groups. This is very important. And I do believe the small changes, they have huge impacts. We all expect that, general and large-scale change from governments and, governments together. But, simply, if we do not change at a small scale, things do not work. They do not come in. And so that's why I believe on small-scale actions like teaching on a class, just as I described, as a course like philosophy and practice of capoeira. How can you take capoeira, a Afro-Brazilian martial art, as an instrument of education, anti-racist education? So I believe on those small actions, just to answer a couple of things that we put it over here as you asked.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much, Prof. And Prof. Greg, if you will please come up and yes, please, your insights.
I can only endorse what my colleagues are saying.
Okay.
It's the big and the small and the molecular, all of that, and the cultural work that's so important. to bring people together at a time when there are so many divisions. People in Mitchell's Plain, Athlone, haven't a clue about what's going on in Khayelitsha. And those divisions are obviously expressed politically in terms of who's voting for the DA, who votes for the ANC. You'll see diametrically opposite patterns. 90% of people in Athlone vote DA, 90% of people in Guguletu vote ANC. And of course, a certain proportion are going to vote for the EFF. So there's a completely polarized situation, and it's reflected in cultural activity, in sport. It's reflected in civil society, in the kind of micro forms of organization that are very particularistic. I want to fight for better houses in Guguletu. And so what's needed is the small and the bigger picture to come together in a broad kind of coalition of progressive forces in a place like Cape Town that can tackle the bigger issues of the city as a whole. And I think Ken also mentioned that Cape Town has got a rich legacy of social movements. There are housing activists in different places doing stuff. Some people are occupying spaces and so on. And I think there's a lot of potential in a place like Cape Town to raise these bigger questions of space, geography, and architecture, but to include it in a struggle at a very basic level around culture and how we share our stories and our songs, and how we begin to move into each other's spaces, as it were. So we don't have a Mitchell's Plain that's completely insular and doesn't, relate to the people literally across the road, which is Khayelitsha, So I think overcoming the potential for very deep divisions amongst our own people is one of our biggest challenges here, because the ruling class will play off different people and say, look, coloreds, you've got a better deal here in Cape Town. Vote for the DA. And that's the kind of racial politics that's playing out in this place. Calling people from the Eastern Cape refugees, talking about queue jumpers, people who jump the queue. Who are those people? Those who were here first need to get the houses first. This is a racial narrative that's being presented right now in Cape Town and possibly in other parts of South Africa that we need to contest. So thank you so much for that.
Thanks so much, Professor Greg, Professor Ricardo, and Professor Ken. Thanks for those insights. Dr. Desire, if you will, please.
Yes, thank you. I think from my end, I would like to start on a positive note to say South Africa, including other African countries, they've made significant strides in terms of disability inclusion. But this has mainly been on policy basis, the implementation of policies, the enactment of policies, if I can put it that way. So I think what is needed is that the media can play an important role to say, we need to move beyond the idea of including persons with disabilities by only giving them employment and education opportunities, but also to start to question how they are portrayed in the social media, in print newspapers, and in on TV and on different radio stations. So I think there's a need. The media can play an important role in empowering them in terms of how they are portrayed, and that will contribute in broadening the concept of democracy, because currently persons with disabilities are viewed as second-class citizens, so they also deserve to be viewed as full citizens. And the media can play an important role on that by collaborating with them and giving them, representation to be able to take part in different programs on TV and on radio stations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doc. That's just spot on. Thank you. Iviwe, are you still with us in the house? If you can please just come up, and also if there's one line or two you will want to add along those lines. And particularly, I'm interested in your perspective on not just civil societies, not just journalism, but social media, because we young folks do that a lot. We use our Twitter, not just young folks anyway, but at least it's within our demography a lot, social media, Twitter, Facebook. What is the role of this kind of public spheres, as it were, in raising awareness in these issues and things like that, please?
Thank you so much for that question. I'd like to also at Twitter specifically, because especially for us young people, Twitter seems like the easiest ways now to kind of access our politicians. It's a way to kind of access different departments. If I write something on Twitter and it trends, I get faster answers. The departments, they respond to DMs way more faster. And we think of these contexts where majority of our people lives. About 49% of people in Africa live in rural areas. I wonder how many of those people have access to social media. Data is a big thing in South Africa. Access to data is a big thing in South Africa. So again, Twitter is becoming a great space now where accessibility is concerned. We're able to DM politicians, we are able to get messages through, but it's not a great representation of the people of our country. We don't have a lot of people on Twitter, not even half our population is on Twitter. So much of the problems on Twitter are highly urbanized. There are urban problems, there are problems of people that have access. And now social media, the role of social media is great in the sense that it is able to highlight different problems, but it is not representative. Rural people are not well represented on social media. Now, how can we do that? Again, a confounding variable, that is seldom spoken about is the whole thing of access to data. If we are making departments more accessible to people through social media, what are we saying about the people that don't have access to social media? What are we doing about infrastructure, data infrastructure? So yes, I do agree that social media has a great role, but access to it, via data is not that great. And therefore, people in remote areas cannot really have much of a great access to different systems.
Thank you so much for those thoughts, Iviwe. And thanks so much to all our speakers for joining us this afternoon. It's been a very, very rich conversation. On a final note, Professor Ricardo, if you can just in a minute respond to the question here that says, Ricardo, will you please speak some more about how your university is including so-called non-academic knowledge, e.g. shamans, in the discourse? Just a minute, please.
Right.
Can I just, before Ricardo kicks off, say thank you to everybody? I unfortunately have to go, and I hand it over to Ricardo. Take care.
Thanks so much, Prof. Thanks so much. Okay. Cheers.
Okay.
So I will try to do it fast. Actually, as at the democratic time, I have to insist in this period of time that Lula, Dilma's government, there were huge extension of university everywhere, especially in the countryside. So as this extension happened here in Brazil, many population that had no access to university came into the university. And as I said, those are traditional communities. Quilombos, I don't know if you are aware of this word, it's called, in Portuguese is quilombo, I think in English is marrons, something like this. And indigenous groups. So they produce interesting knowledge to survive. Most of those people have no formal education. They have no graduated certificate or anything like this. But they produce knowledge, which are interesting for us. In this case of this shaman, which is, we call it pajé in Portuguese, is indigenous healer. He has been attending his community for several decades, as well as other shamans who belong to this community. So how can we deny this? How can we simply not look at this as knowledge, as the knowledge we produce at the university? That's the question. And many indigenous populations are right now into the university and pressing the university from inside. They are saying, hey, okay, you include us here. Physically, we are here. But our knowledge, the knowledge of our community is not here. And the way we proceed of giving and teaching, our teaching methods of learning our culture. So we couldn't just be blind for that, That's why this process came in. As I said, at the university I work, we have many Black communities, especially for African communities, from Mozambique, Guinea, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and also Afro-Brazilian communities. And they produce this knowledge, and they have been questioning us. Why? Why our knowledge is not considered a knowledge as Western science?
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. That's some very interesting perspective and detail. Thanks so much, Prof. On a final note now, I've said that will be the final question, but I just see another question now that I think, if you are still there, can you please react to this briefly? This is Mark saying, if you will, how do we consider the rise in e-learning considering the lack of data access? The rise in e-learning considering the lack of access to data. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I actually I love that question because there was a conference about that earlier in the year that I was part of. I think firstly we need to our outlook or our perspective of e-learning should shift a little bit. I think digital learning is possible, relative to e-learning. E-learning, I'd say, is online learning and needs a lot of data, and we don't have a lot of that in this country. But that does not mean that we can't move to digital learning, where people learn digital skills outside of the web, where we have, designed programs that don't need data. We saw, I think, in Rwanda is doing great in this aspect, of digital learning. So yes, access to data is a huge problem. Some people are even starting to say that, not having access to data is going to become a violation of a human right, especially given the context we're living in now. I think that as a country, we always have a huge, what I call device dump in rural areas. Actually be surprised by how many schools in rural areas actually have devices but are unable to use them. And again, it goes back to the issue of internet. I think that as a country, what we should do more is to have design programs, digital programs that are kind of engineered to help develop, digital skills, our pupils' digital skills, but that don't really need data. Because I think that's going to become a bit of a problem because, there's a lot of capitalism where that is concerned. There are corporations that are going to lose money if, data prices, start to dwindle. So that's what I think. I think that digital learning is more possible at this context relative to e-learning or online learning.
Thank you very much for your thoughts on that. And this is where we'll wrap up on this particular panel. This is panel 3, Higher Education and Social Justice. Thank you so much to our presenters for those interesting perspective and the dynamics you've brought to not just the panel, but to the conference as a whole. Thank you so very much. And to the audience, thank you for listening. Thank you for coming online. Thank you for staying all through the panel discussion. Thank you so much. And just to announce quickly that we are going to be having a keynote address by 5 p.m. and that is going to be, that's themed Democracy and the City. It's going to be a very interesting one that you don't want to miss. So we'll be going on a short break now and we'll reconvene by 5 p.m. for the keynote address. Thank you so very much, everyone. Yes, we'll see you again by 5 p.m.